The laughter started before I even crossed the hall. I heard it echo off the high stone walls of my own family estate, sharp and cruel, rolling toward me like a wave I could not stop. I already knew what they were laughing at. I did not need to look. But I looked anyway, because pretending not to notice would have made it worse. He stood by the entrance, exactly where I had left him that morning, still, silent, watching the room the way a man watches weather, waiting to see which direction the wind would turn. His name was Ethan Cole, and he was, according to the treaty signed between my people and his distant blue planet, my personal guard. He did not look like a guard. He did not look like anything my world would call dangerous. No armor plating that hummed with energy. No blade that could cut through stone. No eyes that glowed with implants or enhancements. Just a man, a tall, quiet, ordinary-looking man, standing near the doorway with his arms loosely at his sides, wearing a simple dark uniform, with no medals, no rank markings, nothing that announced who he was or what he could do. "Lady Quinn," a voice called out, dripping with amusement. It was Draven Vosk, heir to a rival house, his silver eyes glittering with delight. "I see the humans have sent you their finest specimen. Should we applaud, or should we be concerned for his safety among us?" The room laughed again, not politely, not the way courtiers laugh to be kind. This was the kind of laughter that wanted to be heard, that wanted to wound. I felt my face grow warm, and I hated myself for it. I was the last daughter of House Quinn, heir to lands that stretched across 3 moons, and I was standing in my own home being humiliated because of the man assigned to protect me. "He does not need your approval, Lord Vosk," I said, keeping my voice level. "He needs only to do his duty." "His duty," Vosk repeated, savoring the word like it was something sweet. "And what duty is that? To stand very still? To look serious?" I have seen decorative statues with more presence. More laughter. I glanced toward Ethan. He had not moved. He had not reacted at all, as if the words meant nothing to him, as if they were simply noise in a room full of noise. I could not decide if that made things better or worse. I had asked for this assignment to be cancelled. I remembered the meeting clearly, only 3 weeks earlier, when my father's advisor first told me the terms of the new alliance treaty required certain noble families to accept human protectors as a gesture of goodwill between our worlds. I had argued, I had pointed out, quite reasonably I thought, that humans were the newest species to enter galactic society, barely a century removed from fighting wars with metal machines that could not even leave their own atmosphere. I had asked why my safety should depend on a species that the rest of the galaxy still considered, at best, an interesting curiosity, and at worst, a liability. My father had not listened. Politics rarely listens to reason. And so here I was, 3 weeks later, watching my own court mock the man meant to keep me alive, and feeling every bit of embarrassment that came with it. "Lady Quinn," Vosk continued, stepping closer, clearly enjoying himself. "Perhaps you should ask your father for a refund. I hear the humans give discounts on defective units." I opened my mouth to respond, some sharp retort forming, when a new voice cut through the room. Calm, unhurried, almost bored. "You can keep talking," Ethan said, "or you can let her get to her seat before the meal turns cold. Either way, I am not moving from this door." The room went quiet for a moment, stunned that the human had spoken at all. Then Vosk laughed harder than before, and several of the courtiers joined him, delighted by what they saw as a small, harmless man finally showing a spark of spirit before being crushed by wit sharper than his own. "Careful," Vosk said, grinning at Ethan now. "I have killed men on my homeworld for lesser insults." "Then it's a good thing we're not on your homeworld," Ethan replied, and something in his tone made the laughter falter, just slightly, just for a second, though I could not have said why. I walked past both of them without another word, my cheeks burning, and took my seat at the long dining table where my father sat at the head, pretending, as he always did, not to notice the chaos around his daughter. The dinner passed the way dinners in my house always passed. Formal, cold, full of careful words hiding careless intentions. I barely tasted the food. I kept glancing toward the doorway where Ethan stood, unmoved by the entire evening, watching the room with the same quiet attention he had shown from the very beginning. When the meal finally ended, and the guests began to leave, whispering behind their hands as they passed him, I found myself alone with him, in the long hallway that led to my chambers. It was the first time we had truly spoken since he arrived. "You could have said nothing," I told him, my voice sharper than I intended. "You could have simply stood there and let it pass. Instead, you gave them more to laugh about." "They were already laughing," he said. "Nothing I said changed that. It embarrassed you." "Did it embarrass you?" The question caught me off guard. I did not answer right away, and he did not push for one. We walked together in silence for a moment, our footsteps echoing against the polished floor, until I finally spoke again. "Why aren't you angry?" I asked. "They mocked you in front of the entire court. They called you defective. They compared you to a broken machine. Any warrior of my world would have challenged them for less." Ethan considered the question for a moment, his expression unreadable in the dim hallway light. "Where I come from," he said, "the people who talk the loudest before a fight are usually the ones who have never actually been in one." "You think Vosk has never fought?" "I think Vosk has never fought anyone who could actually hurt him," Ethan said. "There's a difference." I studied him carefully, trying to understand what he meant, trying to see past the plain uniform and the unremarkable face to whatever it was that made him so calm in a room that wanted to break him. I found nothing I could point to. No obvious strength, no visible confidence beyond simple stillness. "You don't even carry a weapon," I said. "Every guard in this house carries a weapon. You carry nothing." "I carry what I need," he said simply. "And what is that?" He looked at me then, and for just a moment, something shifted behind his eyes, something quiet and old and far heavier than the calm expression on his face suggested. "You'll see," he said. I wanted to press further, to demand a real answer, something I could understand, something that would explain why my father had trusted this particular man with my life. But something in his tone told me the conversation was finished, at least for tonight. Before I reached my door, my handmaiden Saren caught up with me, her face flushed with the same second-hand embarrassment that seemed to follow me through every hallway of my own home lately. "The whole staff is talking about it," she said quietly, matching my pace. "About him. Some of the kitchen workers have wagered on how long he lasts before your father sends him back." "Sends him back to where?" I said, more sharply than I intended. "This is his assignment. There is nowhere to send him back to except home, and that would be a far greater insult to the treaty than anything Vosk said tonight." Saren fell silent at that, sensing my mood had shifted somewhere she did not want to follow. I softened my tone, though the tightness in my chest did not ease. "I am not defending him," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I was not entirely certain that was true. "I am simply tired of hearing my own house's business discussed over kitchen wagers." She nodded and left me at the corridor that led toward my chambers, and I continued alone, the sound of the dinner's laughter still ringing faintly in my ears, mixed now with the memory of Ethan's quiet, unbothered voice cutting through Vosk's mockery without raising in volume even once. I turned and walked toward my chambers, leaving him standing at his post outside my door, exactly where he would remain through the long hours of night, unmoving, unbothered, watching the darkness the way he watched everything else, as if he already knew something the rest of us did not. I did not sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vosk's mocking smile, heard the laughter of the court echoing through the hall, and felt the weight of a decision I had never wanted, tied now to a man I did not understand. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself the treaty would end eventually, that this arrangement was temporary, a political inconvenience I simply had to endure. I told myself that whatever quiet confidence Ethan carried was likely nothing more than a well-trained mask, taught to him before he left his homeworld, meant to make humans appear less afraid than they actually were. I believed that, for exactly 6 more days. Then came the sparring match that would change everything I thought I knew about the man standing outside my door, and about the world he had come from. The challenge came the way most humiliations in my world arrived, wrapped in polite language and delivered with a smile. It happened during the seasonal gathering of noble houses, an event my family hosted every year in the open courtyard behind our estate, where champions from rival houses traditionally demonstrated their skill in supervised matches. It was tradition, entertainment, and quiet political theater all at once, a way for houses to display their strength without actual bloodshed. Draven Vosk arranged it, of course. He arranged it the way a predator arranges a trap, dressing cruelty up as sport. "A friendly exhibition," he announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "In honor of the new alliance between our peoples, I propose a demonstration, my own champion, Tarek, against Lady Quinn's human guard. Nothing serious, of course. Simply a chance for us to appreciate what Earth considers combat training." The crowd murmured with interest, and I felt my stomach tighten. Tarek was Vosk's personal champion, a warrior nearly twice the size of any human I had seen, with reinforced limbs and combat scars that told their own story of victories won. He had fought in 3 border conflicts and walked away from all of them. Everyone in the courtyard knew his reputation. No one in that courtyard knew anything about Ethan's. I could have refused. I had every right to decline on Ethan's behalf, to protect him from a fight designed purely to embarrass him publicly. I opened my mouth to do exactly that. "I accept," Ethan said, before I could speak a single word. I turned to look at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the fear I would have expected from someone about to face an opponent so clearly stronger. I found none. He simply stepped forward into the open ring at the center of the courtyard, rolling his shoulders once, the way someone might stretch before a light morning exercise rather than before facing a trained warrior twice his size. "You do not have to do this," I whispered to him as he passed. "I know," he said. "I want to." Tarek entered the ring from the opposite side, cracking his knuckles theatrically for the benefit of the crowd, drawing another round of appreciative laughter. He wore no armor either, matching the terms of the exhibition, but his bare arms alone told a story of raw physical power that made the difference between the two combatants almost comical. "Try not to break too easily," Tarek said, grinning at Ethan. "Vosk gets upset when I damage his entertainment before the show even starts." Ethan said nothing. He simply settled into a relaxed stance, feet shoulder-width apart, hands loose at his sides, watching Tarek with the same quiet attention he gave everything else. The referee, an elder from a neutral house, raised his hand and called the match to begin. Tarek moved first, exactly as everyone expected, closing the distance with a burst of speed that should have overwhelmed anyone unprepared. His massive fist swung toward Ethan's head, in a blow clearly meant to end the exhibition in a single, humiliating strike. It never landed. I am still not entirely certain what I saw in that moment. One instant Tarek's fist was moving through the air with terrible force, and the next instant Ethan was simply somewhere else, having shifted his position with a small, economical movement that seemed to require no effort at all. Tarek's swing sailed through empty space, where Ethan's head had been a fraction of a second earlier. Before Tarek could recover his balance, Ethan's hand found his wrist, and with a motion so smooth it barely looked like violence at all, Tarek was suddenly on the ground, his massive frame folded awkwardly against the stones of the courtyard, Ethan's knee resting lightly against his shoulder, holding him perfectly still. The entire exchange had taken perhaps 2 seconds. The courtyard fell into absolute silence. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for the next moment of entertainment, but the heavy, stunned silence of people who had just watched something they could not immediately explain. Tarek lay on the ground, blinking up at the sky, his expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Ethan released him and stepped back, offering a hand to help him up, which Tarek, after a long pause, reluctantly accepted. "That was luck," Tarek muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sure," Ethan said, and walked back toward me without another word, leaving the courtyard in stunned quiet behind him. I watched him approach, my mind struggling to process what I had just witnessed. There had been no visible strength in what he did, no obvious speed beyond what any trained fighter might possess. And yet the outcome had been so complete, so effortless, that it felt almost impossible to have happened the way it did. Around us, the courtiers began whispering among themselves, and I heard the familiar sound of rationalization taking hold, the same defense mechanism people use whenever reality contradicts their comfortable assumptions. Tarek must not have taken it seriously. A lucky trick, nothing more. He will not manage it twice. The human probably studied Tarek's fighting style beforehand. Nothing impressive about knowing your opponent's weaknesses. I heard Vosk's voice among them, tight with barely concealed frustration, insisting loudly that the match meant nothing, that a true measure of strength would look entirely different. No one wanted to believe what they had just seen. It was easier, I realized, to invent 100 small explanations than to accept one large, uncomfortable truth, that everything they believed about human capability might be wrong. I said nothing as Ethan resumed his position beside me, watching the crowd with the same unreadable calm he always wore. "You could have ended that fight more dramatically," I said quietly, once we were walking back toward the estate. "You could have shown them something undeniable. Instead, you gave them an excuse to doubt what they saw." "I didn't do it for them," Ethan said. "Then, who did you do it for?" He glanced at me, and for the first time since his arrival, I saw something almost like amusement cross his features. "You asked me a question in the hallway a few nights ago," he said. "You wanted to know what I carry, if not a weapon." "I remember. That was the answer," he said. "I carry what I need, nothing more." I did not fully understand what he meant, not then. But I found myself watching him differently over the following days, paying closer attention to small details I had previously dismissed as irrelevant. The way his eyes moved constantly across every room we entered, cataloging exits, counting people, measuring distances without seeming to try. The way he never truly relaxed, even during quiet hours, always positioned near doorways, always angled to see the most of any space he occupied. The way he slept for shorter periods than seemed natural, and woke instantly at the smallest unfamiliar sound. I began to ask him questions about his homeworld during the quiet hours we spent together, curious now, in a way I had not been before. He answered carefully, giving me only pieces at a time, but the pieces themselves were unsettling in ways I had not expected. He told me, without any particular emotion in his voice, about a history filled with conflict, stretching back thousands of years before his people had even understood the stars existed beyond their own sky. Wars fought not with elegant energy weapons, but with brutal, close-range tools. Entire generations trained from childhood in the art of surviving other humans who wanted them dead. He spoke of it the way one might describe weather patterns, an unfortunate but unavoidable feature of his species' history, something the rest of the galaxy dismissed as barbaric, as evidence that humans were simply less evolved than species who had moved beyond such primitive behavior. But listening to him, I began to wonder if the galaxy had misunderstood something fundamental. Perhaps it was not that humans were less evolved. Perhaps it was that humans had evolved under conditions far harsher than anything my own comfortable society had faced in centuries, and that harshness had shaped them into something the rest of us simply did not have the tools to recognize. I did not share these thoughts with anyone at court. I was not entirely certain I trusted them myself, not yet. But the seed of doubt Vosk's mockery had planted in me during that first humiliating dinner had begun, slowly, to grow into something else entirely. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of my caution entirely, and I asked him directly what his own people called the wars he had described so plainly, without any of the shame the rest of the galaxy seemed to expect from him. "We call them by many names," he said. "Different conflicts, different centuries, different reasons. But if you're asking whether we're ashamed of that history, the honest answer is complicated. We're not proud of the suffering it caused, but we don't pretend it didn't shape us either. Pretending would be its own kind of dishonesty. The rest of the galaxy calls it evidence of a species too young to control itself, I said. The rest of the galaxy, Ethan replied, has spent the last few centuries expanding into empty space and calling it peace. It's easy to be peaceful when there's nothing forcing you to be anything else. We didn't have that luxury for most of our history. We had to learn how to survive each other before we ever learned how to survive the stars. I turned that thought over for a long while after he said it, comparing it against everything my own education had taught me about galactic history, about the slow, orderly rise of civilizations that had, for the most part, expanded outward into unclaimed systems with little real competition for resources or territory. My people had never truly needed to master conflict, because conflict had rarely found us. Humanity, by every account Ethan gave me, had needed to master almost nothing else, for almost the entirety of its recorded history, simply to continue existing as a species at all. It was an uncomfortable thought, sitting quietly beside a man the entire court still dismissed as an amusing curiosity, and realizing that the discomfort came not from anything he had done, but from how thoroughly it undermined everything I had assumed about my own civilization's supposed superiority. I did not know, as those quiet days passed, that a far greater test was already being arranged, one that would have nothing to do with sparring matches or courtyard exhibitions, and everything to do with survival itself. The trouble began the way most serious trouble begins in noble houses, quietly, buried beneath layers of formal language and careful smiles, until it could no longer be contained. My father's health had been declining for months, a fact the family had worked hard to keep from public knowledge. With his decline came questions about inheritance, about the future control of House Quinn's holdings across 3 moons, and about who among the extended family and allied houses stood to benefit most from a change in leadership. I was the only direct heir, but inheritance disputes rarely respect simple lines of succession when enough wealth and power are involved. I first heard the rumors from Corin, my father's most trusted advisor, a thin, careful man who had served our family since before I was born. He found me in the estate's private study late one evening, his expression grave in a way that immediately set my nerves on edge. "There is something you need to know," he said, closing the door behind him with unusual care. "It concerns your safety." "Tell me," I said, setting aside the papers I had been reviewing. "House Marrow has grown impatient," he said. "They believe your father's condition presents an opportunity, and they believe you represent an obstacle to whatever plans they have made for the inheritance dispute. I have received reliable information that they have made contact with the Ashvale Circle." I felt the blood drain from my face. Everyone in noble circles knew the name Ashvale, spoken always in hushed tones, always with an undercurrent of fear that few other names could produce. They were not soldiers. They were not warriors who fought with honor in open exhibitions like the courtyard matches I had recently witnessed. They were something far more dangerous, a guild of professional killers whose members were rumored to have never failed a contract in over a century of operation. No one knew their true numbers. No one had ever captured one alive to interrogate. Their reputation was built entirely on results, and their results were, without exception, absolute. "Are you certain?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "As certain as such matters allow," Corin said. "I would not have brought this to you otherwise. I recommend increasing security immediately, additional guards, perimeter sensors, perhaps relocating you to a more defensible property until this matter is resolved." I found my father in his private study later that same evening, propped against a mountain of cushions, his breathing shallow but his mind still sharp despite his failing body. He had already heard the same rumors Corin brought to me, delivered no doubt by the same careful channels. "You are frightened," he said, before I had even fully entered the room. It was not a question. "Should I not be?" I asked. "House Marrow has hired the Ashvale Circle. Everyone in this house knows what that name means." My father was quiet for a long moment, studying me with the tired, patient expression he had worn more and more often in recent months. "I placed the human guard with you for exactly this reason," he said finally. "Not because I believed the treaty demanded it, though it did. I placed him with you because I made inquiries of my own, quiet ones, through channels the rest of this court does not know exist." "What kind of inquiries?" "I asked what humans are actually capable of, beneath the jokes the rest of the galaxy tells about them," he said. "The answers I received were not jokes at all. Some of our oldest trading partners, the ones who have dealt with Earth's diplomats far longer than our own house has, were remarkably careful in how they phrased their warnings. Careful in a way that told me more than their actual words." I stared at him, surprised by an admission I had not expected. "You knew this, and you let the entire court mock him anyway. You let me be embarrassed for weeks." "I let the court believe what it wanted to believe," my father said, "because a threat no one takes seriously is far more dangerous to those who plan around it than to those it is meant to protect. Vosk's mockery, and yours, gave your guard something valuable. It gave him invisibility. No one watches closely what they have already decided to dismiss." I left his study that night with far more to consider than I had expected, my earlier fear now tangled together with a strange, unfamiliar sense of having been managed, gently, by my own father, for reasons I was only beginning to understand. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay awake in my chambers, listening to the familiar sounds of the estate settling around me, imagining shadows moving where none existed, until finally I rose and made my way to the hallway outside my door, where Ethan stood his usual quiet watch. "You should know something," I told him, and relayed everything Corin had shared with me. I expected fear. I expected, at minimum, some visible reaction, some acknowledgement of the seriousness of what I had just described. Instead, Ethan's expression remained almost entirely unchanged, though something in his posture shifted slightly, a subtle straightening, a small adjustment that reminded me of a hunting animal catching an interesting scent on the wind. "Understood," he said simply. "That's it? Understood?" I stared at him, frustration mixing with fear. "Do you understand what I just told you? The Ashvale Circle has never failed a contract. Never, in over 100 years. "I heard you," he said. "Then why aren't you concerned?" He considered the question for a long moment before answering, choosing his words with unusual care. "I am concerned," he said. "For you, not for myself." "That makes no sense," I said. "If they are as dangerous as everyone says, you should be terrified. We should both be terrified." "Terror doesn't keep people alive," Ethan said. "Preparation does." Over the following days, I watched him change his patterns in small, deliberate ways. He requested detailed floor plans of the entire estate, studying every hallway, every window, every possible point of entry, with an intensity that unsettled the household staff. He slept even less than before, if that was possible, taking short periods of rest at irregular hours that made his schedule almost impossible to predict, even for those of us who lived under the same roof. He began positioning himself differently at night, no longer simply standing outside my door, but moving through darkened hallways at intervals, checking locks, testing windows, memorizing the sound of the house at rest so thoroughly that he would immediately notice anything out of place. I found myself watching him during these preparations, torn between fear for what was coming and a growing, cautious curiosity about the man tasked with standing between me and it. "You've done this before," I said one evening, finding him examining the mechanism of a window latch in the east wing with a small tool I did not recognize. "This isn't the first time someone has come for you, or for someone you were protecting." "No," he said, not looking up from his work. "It isn't." "What happened the other times?" He paused, setting the tool down carefully, and looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, something quieter, older, carrying weight he rarely allowed to show. "The people who came for them," he said, "didn't leave the way they arrived." I did not ask him to elaborate. Something in his tone told me the details, whatever they were would not bring comfort to either of us. 3 nights after Corin's warning, the tension in the estate had grown thick enough to feel a kind of pressure in the air that made every servant move a little faster, speak a little quieter, glance a little more often toward shadowed corners. My father had been informed of the threat and had agreed, reluctantly, to double the standard household security, though Ethan had made clear in a private conversation with Corin that additional guards, in his professional assessment, would do little to stop what was coming and might in fact make things worse by creating confusion during any actual engagement. "Then what do you suggest?" Corin had asked, visibly frustrated by Ethan's apparent dismissal of standard security protocol. "Let me handle the perimeter," Ethan had said. "Keep your guards focused on the ladies' immediate safety, inside, close, where they can actually help if something goes wrong. Outside is my responsibility." Corin had reluctantly agreed, though I could see in his expression that he did not fully trust a single human guard to manage what an entire security detail could not. I understood his doubt. Even after everything I had witnessed, some small part of me still carried the same doubt, buried beneath weeks of growing respect I had not yet fully acknowledged. Corin, for his part, remained unconvinced by Ethan's approach, and made his doubts known during a tense meeting 3 days after the initial warning, attended by myself, my father's physician standing in for my father, and the captain of our household guard, a stern old soldier named Tarn who had served the family for decades. "One man cannot secure an entire perimeter," Tarn argued, his voice tight with professional frustration. "I have 12 trained guards at my disposal, and I am being told to keep them clustered near the ladies' chambers while a single outsider wanders the grounds alone. If something happens outside, we will have no warning at all." "You'll have warning," Ethan said calmly. "You just won't need to act on it before it's already finished." Tarn's expression darkened at that, clearly reading arrogance into words that I had already learned over the preceding weeks were not arrogance at all, but simple, unadorned confidence. "You mock my guard's capability." "I'm not mocking anyone," Ethan said. "I'm telling you that whoever comes for the lady will come prepared for 12 guards standing in predictable positions. They will not come prepared for one person who refuses to be predictable at all. That unpredictability is the only real advantage we have against people who plan this carefully for a living." The room remained tense long after that exchange, and I could see in Tarn's face that he did not fully accept the reasoning, even as he reluctantly agreed to follow the arrangement my father had authorized before his condition worsened further. I found myself, in the days that followed, watching the household guards go about their doubled patrols with a strange, detached awareness that their presence, however comforting it felt in the moment, might matter far less than any of us wanted to believe. On the 4th night after the warning, everything changed. I remember the evening had been unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that in hindsight felt like the world holding its breath. I had gone to bed earlier than usual, exhausted from days of tension and disrupted sleep, and had fallen into a restless doze sometime after midnight. I woke to darkness. Not the familiar darkness of my chambers at night, softened by the faint glow of ambient lighting that ran along the floor molding of every room in the estate. This was complete darkness, absolute, the kind that told me immediately, before I had even fully opened my eyes, that something in the house's power systems had failed, or had been made to fail. I sat up in bed, my heart already racing, straining to hear any sound in the silent house. For a long moment, I heard nothing at all, the silence so complete it felt like its own kind of threat. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep in the eastern wing of the estate, I heard the soft, distinct sound of a door opening slowly, carefully, by someone who did not want to be heard. I remembered Ethan's instructions immediately, given to me 2 nights earlier with unusual firmness, the only time since his arrival that his calm voice had carried something close to urgency. "If anything happens at night," he had told me, "anything at all, you do not leave this room, no matter what you hear. No matter how long it takes. You stay here, and you trust me to handle everything outside that door." I had promised him I would. Sitting in the darkness now, listening to the distant sound of a door I knew should never have opened on its own, I understood for the first time exactly how difficult that promise would be to keep. Somewhere beyond my chambers, in the black, silent corridors of my family's estate, something had begun that I could not see, could not stop, and could barely even understand. All I could do was sit in the darkness, remember his instructions, and wait. I do not know how long I sat in the darkness before the first sound reached me, though it felt like hours compressed into minutes, every second stretched thin by fear. It began as a faint scrape, distant and quiet, the kind of sound a careful foot makes against stone when its owner is trying very hard not to be heard. Then silence again, long enough that I began to wonder if I had imagined it entirely. I pressed myself against the headboard of my bed, knees drawn to my chest, straining every sense toward the darkened doorway of my chambers. A second sound followed, closer this time, and unmistakably real. A soft click, like a mechanism disengaging somewhere down the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I thought of the household guards Corin had doubled just days earlier, wondering if the sound belonged to one of them making rounds, wondering if I was terrifying myself over nothing more than ordinary night movement in an ordinary house. Then I heard the first voice. It was not loud, it was barely more than a whisper, carried faintly through the walls in a language I did not recognize, clipped and efficient, the kind of speech pattern used by people who communicate only what is absolutely necessary. A second voice answered, equally quiet, equally foreign, and I understood with sudden, terrible clarity that these were not household guards making their rounds. They were already inside. I remembered Ethan's instructions and forced myself to stay perfectly still, my hand pressed against my mouth to keep my breathing quiet, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, to hide somewhere smaller, to do anything except sit motionless in a room with only one door. The whispers moved closer, passing somewhere near the hallway outside my chambers, and I heard for the first time the specific sound of multiple footsteps, careful and coordinated, the movement of people who had clearly rehearsed this exact approach many times before. I counted at least 3 distinct patterns of footfall, though the darkness and my own racing heartbeat made it difficult to be certain. A long silence followed, stretching so far that I began to believe, desperately, that they had somehow passed my chambers entirely, moving on toward some other part of the estate. Then I heard something that shattered that hope completely. A sound from directly outside my door. Not footsteps, something else. A soft mechanical whir, barely audible, followed by the faint click of my door's locking mechanism disengaging from the outside. I pressed myself deeper against the headboard, every muscle locked with fear, watching the outline of my door in the darkness, waiting for it to open. It did not open. Instead, I heard something entirely unexpected. A sharp intake of breath from the hallway, sudden and involuntary, followed immediately by a brief, muffled sound of impact, and then silence. Complete, total silence, so different from the careful quiet that had come before that I found myself holding my own breath without meaning to. More sounds followed, close together now, overlapping in ways that made them difficult to distinguish individually. A quick scuffle of movement, another sharp breath, cut short, something heavy shifting against the wall outside my room, controlled, not the sound of a struggle so much as the sound of something being carefully guided to the floor. Then silence again. I do not know how long that second silence lasted. Time had lost all meaning to me by that point, every second stretched by fear into something far longer than its actual length. I sat frozen, staring at my door, waiting for it to open, waiting to learn whether the silence meant safety or something far worse. Somewhere in the walls, a faint vibration passed through the floor beneath my bare feet, so slight I might have missed it entirely if every other sense had not already been stretched to its absolute limit. I imagined, against my own will, every possible shape that vibration could belong to, and none of the images my mind produced brought any comfort at all. I thought, briefly and irrationally, of calling out, of shouting some warning into the darkness that might reach household guards elsewhere in the estate. I stopped myself only because some deeper instinct, sharper than my fear, told me that breaking the silence now would accomplish nothing except revealing my exact location to anyone still moving through the darkened halls who did not already know it. A third voice spoke, this one closer than any before, low and urgent, no longer bothering with the careful whisper the others had used. I could not understand the words, but I understood the tone completely. It was the tone of someone whose plan had gone wrong, someone recalculating in real time, someone afraid. More movement followed, faster now, less coordinated than before, footsteps hurrying rather than creeping, and beneath them something else. A sound I could only describe as pursuit, quick and controlled, moving through the darkness with a confidence that felt entirely different from the frightened haste of whoever it was chasing. I heard a door somewhere down the hallway burst open, followed by another brief, muffled exchange, shorter this time, ending almost as soon as it began. Then, for a long stretch of time that felt endless, I heard nothing at all. I do not know what made me finally move. Perhaps it was the silence itself, unbearable in its uncertainty, or perhaps it was simple desperation, the need to know rather than continue imagining. I rose from my bed on unsteady legs and crept toward my door, pressing my ear against the cool wood, straining to hear anything beyond it. Nothing. My hand found the handle before my mind had fully decided to move it, and I hesitated there, remembering Ethan's instructions, remembering my promise to stay inside no matter what I heard. But the silence had gone on too long, and fear of the unknown had become worse than fear of whatever waited beyond the door. I opened it slowly, just a crack, just enough to see into the darkened hallway beyond. What I saw stole the breath from my lungs entirely. 3 figures lay motionless along the corridor, dressed in dark, form-fitting suits unlike anything I had seen among household staff or estate security. Their faces were covered, their equipment sophisticated in ways that spoke clearly of professional training, of resources far beyond ordinary hired muscle. They were not moving. Standing among them, near the far end of the hallway, was Ethan. He looked almost exactly as he always did, calm, still, his breathing barely elevated despite whatever had just taken place around him. A small mark along his jaw suggested some contact had been made, but otherwise he appeared entirely unmarked by whatever violence had unfolded in the darkness of my family's hallway. Facing him, perhaps 10 paces away, stood 2 more figures, dressed identically to the ones lying motionless on the floor. One of them, clearly positioned as the leader, based on subtle differences in equipment and bearing, stood frozen in place, staring at Ethan with an expression I could not fully interpret in the dim emergency lighting that had finally begun flickering back to life along the floor molding. No one moved for a long moment. The hallway held a strange, heavy stillness, as though everyone present understood that something significant was happening, something beyond the simple mathematics of numbers and weapons. Then, slowly, deliberately, the leader raised one hand and made a small, sharp gesture. The remaining figure beside them immediately stepped back, retreating toward the shadows at the far end of the hallway. The leader lingered a moment longer, still staring at Ethan with an intensity that seemed to carry something beyond simple caution, something closer to recognition, before finally turning and following their companion into the darkness. They did not attack. They did not attempt to complete whatever mission had brought them into my family's home that night. They simply left, moving with the same careful, practiced efficiency with which they had arrived, disappearing into the shadows of the estate as though the 3 motionless figures behind them were an acceptable loss for the privilege of retreat. I stood frozen in my doorway, unable to fully process what I had just witnessed. Ethan remained still for several more seconds after the figures vanished. Listening, I realized, making certain they had truly gone and were not simply repositioning for another approach. Only when he seemed satisfied did he finally turn toward me, his expression softening slightly at the sight of me standing there, clearly having disobeyed his instructions to stay inside. "You're safe," he said, his voice carrying none of the adrenaline I would have expected after what had just occurred. "It's over." They ran, I said, my voice barely steady, still staring at the empty end of the hallway where the two remaining figures had disappeared. They had you outnumbered. They still had a chance. Why would they run? Ethan glanced down the hallway, toward the darkness where the retreating figures had vanished, and something crossed his features that I had never seen there before, something almost like weariness, mixed with an old, familiar sadness. Because they recognize something, he said quietly. And once someone like that recognizes what they're actually looking at, running is the only logical choice left. Recognized what? I asked, my mind still struggling to process the scale of what had just happened around me while I hid, helpless, behind a locked door. What did they see in you that made them abandon the entire mission? Ethan looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him deciding how much to tell me, weighing words carefully the way he always did. That's a longer conversation, he said finally, than we should have standing in a hallway at this hour. He moved toward me then, checking me over with quick, practiced efficiency to confirm I was unharmed, before guiding me firmly back toward the relative safety of my chambers, while household security, finally alerted by the restored lighting and the commotion, began flooding into the hallway behind us, their faces pale with shock at what they found. Tarn arrived among the first of them, his weapon drawn, his eyes moving rapidly across the three motionless figures still lying along the corridor floor. He said nothing for a long moment, simply staring at the scene with an expression that had shifted, entirely and permanently, from the skepticism he had voiced days earlier. When he finally looked up at Ethan, standing calm and mostly unmarked amid the wreckage of an assignment that should have overwhelmed him completely, something in the old soldier's bearing changed as well, a stiff, formal respect replacing the guarded doubt he had carried since their first meeting. "How many were there?" Tarn asked quietly. "In total?" "5, Ethan said. 3 you can see. 2 chose to leave." Tarn glanced down the darkened hallway where the retreating figures had vanished, then back at the 3 unconscious forms nearest his feet, and said nothing further, though his silence carried more weight than any words could have offered. I did not sleep again that night. I sat by my window instead, watching the first gray light of dawn slowly creep across the estate grounds, replaying the entire encounter in my mind, searching for some detail that would explain what I had witnessed. I had been prepared, in the days leading up to that night, to accept that Ethan was simply skilled, perhaps exceptionally so, a talented individual among an otherwise unremarkable species. What I had witnessed in that hallway suggested something far beyond individual skill. It suggested that the fear itself, the almost instinctive retreat of professionals who had reportedly never failed a contract in over a century, was rooted in something deeper than the outcome of a single encounter. They had not simply lost the fight. They had recognized something about what they were fighting, and that recognition alone had been enough to make them abandon an assignment worth, undoubtedly, an enormous sum of money and reputation within their own dangerous profession. I needed to understand what that recognition meant. I needed to understand, finally and completely, exactly what kind of man my father had unknowingly placed at my door, and exactly what kind of species the rest of the galaxy had spent decades quietly, foolishly, underestimating. The answers, I would soon learn, were far larger than anything I had imagined during those long weeks of quiet mockery and doubt. The morning after the attack, the estate moved like a place recovering from a storm no one had seen coming. Household security swept every corridor, medical staff attended to the 3 unconscious figures left behind, and Corin spent hours in urgent communication with allied houses, attempting to determine exactly how deeply House Marrow's betrayal ran. Through all of it, I found myself unable to focus on anything except the questions burning in my mind since the previous night. I found Ethan in the estate's eastern garden shortly after midday, sitting alone on a stone bench beneath the shade of an old flowering tree, the first genuinely still moment I had seen him take since his arrival weeks earlier. He looked tired in a way I had not seen from him before, not physically exhausted, but carrying something heavier, something that seemed to sit behind his eyes. "You promised me a longer conversation," I said, sitting beside him without waiting for an invitation. I think we've earned it. He was quiet for a moment, watching the light move through the branches overhead, before finally speaking. The people who came for you last night, he said, belong to the Ashvale Circle, exactly as your advisor warned. Professional killers, extremely well-trained, extremely well-paid. Your advisor was right that they have never failed a contract in over a century. Then why did they fail last night? They didn't just fail, Ethan said. They saw something that told them failing was the best possible outcome available to them, and they took it immediately, without hesitation, because the alternative was worse. What alternative? Ethan turned to look at me fully then, and something in his expression carried a weight I had not seen from him before, an old, careful honesty he seemed to be deciding, finally, to share. People like that operate on calculation, he said. Risk against reward. Every contract they accept, every target they pursue, gets weighed against the danger involved and the payment offered. It's a business, and like any business, survival depends on knowing when a job has become unprofitable. And I became unprofitable simply because of you? Not because of me specifically, Ethan said. Because of what I represent to people who study risk professionally. My homeworld has a long, difficult history, one your galaxy has generally dismissed as primitive, as evidence that we are somehow less developed than species who fought wars with cleaner, more elegant weapons. But that history produced something the rest of the galaxy never had reason to develop. It produced people trained, sometimes from childhood, in environments where losing meant death, where hesitation meant death, where the only acceptable outcome in a genuine conflict was making certain you were the one who walked away. And the assassins recognized that in you, simply from a hallway encounter. Professionals like the Ashvale Circle don't survive a century of contracts by being reckless, Ethan said. They survive by reading situations accurately, faster than almost anyone else. The way I moved, the way I positioned myself, the way I neutralized their advance team without wasted motion, without hesitation, without the kind of fear response they're trained to look for in ordinary opponents. Within seconds of engaging me, their leader understood exactly what kind of opponent they were actually facing and made the only rational choice available. They cut their losses and retreated because continuing meant accepting odds no professional survives long by accepting. I sat with that explanation for a long moment, turning it over in my mind, remembering every small detail from the weeks since his arrival that I had previously dismissed or misunderstood. The calm dismissal of Vosk's mockery, the effortless victory over Tarek in the courtyard, the quiet, methodical preparation in the days leading up to the attack. None of it had been arrogance, or luck, or some mysterious human trick, as the court had insisted on believing. It had all been exactly what it appeared to be, the natural behavior of someone whose baseline for danger sat at a level the rest of us had simply never needed to reach. You said your history produced people like this, I said slowly. Does that mean there are others, on your world, who could do what you did last night? Something like a faint, tired smile crossed Ethan's face, the first genuine amusement I had seen from him since the attack. Many others, he said. Better trained than me, in some cases. I served in a fairly ordinary capacity before joining the Diplomatic Protection Program. There are people on Earth who would consider what happened last night a fairly routine evening. The idea settled over me slowly, heavy and strange, reshaping everything I thought I understood about the newest species to join galactic society. The rest of the galaxy had looked at humanity's brief, difficult history and seen only chaos, only violence, only evidence of a species too primitive to have moved beyond conflict, the way older, more established civilizations had. No one had considered that the same history might have produced something the galaxy's comfortable, peaceful societies simply had no framework to properly measure. We had called them primitive. We had mocked them at dinner tables and courtyard exhibitions, certain that our advanced technology and centuries of relative peace made us naturally superior. And all along, The very history we dismissed as evidence of their weakness had instead forged something the galaxy's most feared professionals recognized immediately as a threat too dangerous to engage. Word of the attack and its unusual outcome spread through noble circles faster than any official statement my family issued. Within days, the same courtiers who had laughed at Ethan during that first humiliating dinner began asking careful, curious questions, their mockery replaced by a wary, uncertain respect they clearly did not fully understand themselves. Draven Vosk, in particular, avoided the subject entirely whenever it arose in his presence, his earlier confidence about human inferiority nowhere to be found. Tarn, in particular, underwent a transformation none of us expected from a man who had served the household with rigid, unbending professionalism for decades. He began requesting time with Ethan whenever their duties allowed, asking careful questions about positioning, about reading a room before trouble arrived, about the small habits that had allowed one man to accomplish what an entire train detail had been arranged, but never needed, to attempt. Ethan answered patiently, without any hint of the superiority Tarn had once quietly assumed he would eventually reveal. "You could have let me believe I was simply better trained than your people," Tarn admitted to him one afternoon, within my hearing. "It would have cost you nothing to let the story grow larger than the truth." "The truth already does the work it needs to do," Ethan said. "Growing it larger would only teach your people to fear the wrong things." The household staff, too, began treating Ethan's presence differently in the weeks that followed. The same kitchen workers who had once wagered on how quickly he would be dismissed, now offering him meals before anyone else. The same young pages who had once snickered behind their hands, now watching him with quiet, curious respect whenever he passed through the estate's corridors. Saren, my handmaiden, mentioned once, almost sheepishly, that the wagers in the kitchen had shifted entirely, no longer concerned with how long he would last, but instead with how many more attempts House Marrow's remaining allies might dare to make, and whether any of them would fare better than the first. House Marrow's involvement in the attack was eventually confirmed through careful investigation, leading to a political scandal that consumed noble circles for months afterward, though the details of that fallout are a story of their own, separate from what happened in my family's darkened hallway that night. What mattered most to me, in the weeks that followed, was the quiet shift in how I saw the man standing outside my door each evening. I no longer saw an object of embarrassment, assigned to me by a treaty I had resented from the moment I first heard its terms. I saw someone who had, without complaint, without seeking recognition or gratitude, simply done exactly what he came to do, standing calmly between me and a danger I had not fully understood until it was already inside my home. One evening, several weeks after the attack, I found myself sitting with him again, in the same quiet hallway where our first real conversation had taken place, the tension of that difficult period finally beginning to ease. "I owe you an apology," I told him. "For every doubt I carried about you, from the very first day, I let this entire court's assumptions become my own, and I nearly let those assumptions cost me the only person actually capable of protecting me." "You don't owe me anything," Ethan said. "Doubt was reasonable. You'd never seen anyone like me before. Neither had they." "They still don't understand what they saw," I said. "Even now, they invent stories to explain it away. Luck, trickery, anything except the truth." "That's fine," Ethan said, with a small shrug that carried no bitterness at all. "I didn't come here for their understanding." A young courtier, one of Vosk's own attendants, approached us cautiously that same evening, clearly curious despite the obvious nervousness in his posture. He had heard the stories, like everyone else, and could not quite resist the opportunity to ask the question that had apparently been circulating through noble circles for weeks. "Forgive my forwardness," he said carefully, "but I must ask, what kind of species does what you did that night? Facing skilled professionals, alone, and somehow making them retreat rather than press their advantage." Ethan considered the question for a moment, glancing toward me with the faintest hint of that same tired, amused expression I had come to recognize. "Smart ones," he said simply. The young courtier looked confused by the answer, clearly expecting something more dramatic, more detailed, some grand explanation of hidden strength or secret technology. But I understood exactly what Ethan meant, having spent the previous weeks slowly unlearning every assumption I had carried into our first meeting. It was not about strength alone, or speed, or any single measurable quality the rest of the galaxy could easily compare against its own standards. It was about a species that had learned, through a long and difficult history the rest of us dismissed too quickly, exactly what it cost to survive genuine danger, and had shaped itself accordingly. It was about calm, where others expected panic, preparation, where others expected boasting, and quiet, absolute competence, where others expected the easily dismissed weakness everyone had assumed from the very beginning. My father recovered slowly from his illness in the months that followed, and House Quinn's position among the noble families gradually stabilized as the scandal surrounding House Marrow ran its course. Ethan remained at my side throughout, his position no longer a source of quiet embarrassment, but something closer to quiet pride, though he never once sought recognition for what he had done, content simply to continue his duty exactly as he always had. I think often about that first night, about the mockery in the dining hall, about my own reluctant embarrassment at being assigned a guard the rest of my world considered unworthy of the honor. I think about how close I came to letting that comfortable, convenient assumption define my understanding of an entire species, simply because their history looked unfamiliar against the polished, careful conflicts my own world preferred. The galaxy still underestimates humanity. Even now, even after everything that happened in my family's darkened hallway that night. Old assumptions do not disappear easily, and pride rarely accepts correction gracefully. But I no longer share that assumption, and neither does anyone who witnessed, even briefly, the moment two of the galaxy's most feared professionals looked at one quiet, unremarkable man standing calmly in the dark and decided, without a single word exchanged, that retreat was the only wise choice left to them. Months later, during a formal gathering held to celebrate my father's full recovery, I watched Vosk approach Ethan directly for the first time since the courtyard exhibition, his usual arrogance replaced by something far more careful. He did not apologize, exactly. Pride of his kind rarely allows for anything so direct. Instead, he asked, with unusual hesitation, whether Ethan might be willing to instruct his own household guards in even a fraction of what he had demonstrated that night. "I don't teach for houses that mock the people they're asking to protect them," Ethan said, not unkindly, but without any softness either. Vosk absorbed the refusal quietly, nodded once, and withdrew without further argument, and I found myself, watching the exchange from across the hall, feeling something I would not have believed possible during that first humiliating dinner weeks earlier. I felt proud, not embarrassed, to stand beside the man everyone had once dismissed as an unworthy addition to my household. Later that same evening, as the gathering wound down and guests began departing into the cool night air, I asked Ethan one final question that had lingered in my mind since the morning after the attack. "Do you regret it?" I asked, "leaving your homeworld for an assignment, surrounded by people who mocked you before they ever gave you the chance to prove otherwise?" He considered the question for a long moment, watching the last of the departing carriages move slowly down the estate's long entrance road. "No," he said finally. "People mocking what they don't understand isn't unusual. It isn't even unfair, really. It's just what happens before understanding arrives. The only real failure would have been letting that mockery change what I actually did." I thought about that answer for a long time afterward, long after the gathering ended, long after the estate settled once more into its familiar quiet rhythms. Some lessons, once learned properly, are never forgotten. And I suspect, quietly, that the rest of the galaxy still has a great deal left to learn about the species it so easily dismissed as primitive, the species that sent me, without any fanfare at all, exactly the kind of protector I never knew I needed.